exporting to other countries to try and make up that shortfall that it's no longer getting from property. And there's no sort of end in sight insofar as this is actually part of a longer term strategy on China's part to shift more to sort of upgraded manufacturing and sort of an industrial policy that produces more sophisticated technology. And indeed, this issue of overcapacity in China itself came up at the National People's Congress. That's the sort of annual parliamentary meeting in China. And officials know that they need to deal with this overcapacity problem domestically in order to find buyers of these products, such as EVs, solar panels, and so on, in the rest of the world.
Oliver, what options have the government got? I understand that the Brazilian steel makers have requested that the government slap tariffs of between sort of 10% and 25% on imported steel.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting to hear sort of the story from the Chinese perspective. Of course, you know, speaking to people from the industry, they have very little comprehension of, why is China doing this currently? And I think the chorus of those asking for tariffs is growing louder, and I find it difficult to imagine that the president can ignore them for long, particularly as we've just heard. This is not going away anytime soon.
Okay.
And President Lula is really intent on promoting the national industry, and that's part of also his governing coalition, whereas most of the agribusiness has been voting for Bolsonaro in the past.
Okay, well, we're going to leave that conversation there and move to Cuba, where the island nation is witnessing rare protests. Hundreds of protesters have taken to the streets in Santiago, Cuba's second largest city, and they're demanding two critical things: food and power. The island is facing its worst economic crisis in 3 decades, with parts of Cuba being left without power for more than 10 hours a day. Demonstrations in Cuba are rare because they're usually met with repression. Cuba has summoned the top American diplomat in Havana to complain about what it's called interfering conduct after the protests. The Foreign Ministry blamed US sanctions on Cuba's difficult economic situation. The US Deputy State Department spokesperson Dev Patel said that those accusations were absurd.
What we are seeing is a reflection of the dire situation on the island. We urge the Cuban government to refrain from violence and unjust detentions and are calling on the authorities to respect the Cuban citizens' right to peaceful assembly.
Well, let's get a picture of what life is like in Cuba right now. Earlier I spoke to Carla Colomay. She is a Cuban journalist. She's based in New York, and she's the founder of the Cuban magazine El Estro Nudo.
The protest started in Santiago de Cuba. Santiago de Cuba is a province in the east of the country, and they multiply in several provinces around the country.
When you talk about the power cuts, can you describe those for us?
Yes, for example, Cuban people can't live without electricity for 12 hours a day. It's very difficult because without electricity, you can't do your food, you can't do it a lot of things, and people is stressed with this situation.
But how often will those power cuts last for 12 hours?
Every day.
Oh, every day?
Yes, government cut the electricity every day. Yes, it's a very complicated situation, and people is tired.
And what about food shortages? Tell us about that.
There aren't rice, there aren't meat, or for example, sugar. You know that Cuba was one of the big producers of sugar in the world, but now in this moment we are without sugar, without rice, without meat, and without a lot of food. But not only food, it's not only food, we are living without medicine. We are one of the most important countries in the health issues in general, and we don't have medicine, we don't have doctors. A lot of people are emigrating now. Cuba is living one of the most important migration crises now.
What do your family tell you about how they are dealing with this shortage of food
Yeah.
and the lights going out constantly.
My family, but not only my family, I've seen that Cuban people is desperate, and the worst thing is that there is no hope for change. Those of us who are outside the country have to bear the burden of the situation. We help our family, we try to get them to leave the country, and it's very difficult for us outside and inside of Cuba.
So I suppose that's why they're protesting, but protests are very rare, aren't they? And people are taking risks, aren't they, by taking
Yes.
part in them?
Exactly. These protests do not usually happen in Cuba, you know, because the Cuban government repressed the demonstrators. But there is an important precedent. In July 2021, thousands of Cubans took the streets to protest for the same reason. And now, what could happen today in Cuba? Thousands of the political prisoners for protesting against the situation in the country. If you ask me what is the greatest risk, is jail for people.
That was Cuban journalist Carla Colomay speaking to me a little earlier on. You are listening to the BBC World Service. This is Business Matters with me, Sam Fennick. I am talking to you from our Media City studios in the north of England. We're joined today by Oliver Stunkel. He is the Associate Professor of International Relations at the Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And Rebecca Chong-Wilkins is with us. She is a Senior Asia Correspondent for Bloomberg. We'll talk to them more, get more of their insight and knowledge on more stories coming up after the latest news.
In just a minute, we'll head back to Business Matters, and in an hour, the documentary investigates the trafficking of Malawian women to Oman.
Laws that are in place prohibit a domestic worker to leave the employer. She cannot change jobs, and she cannot leave the country even if she has her passport, even though she has a flight ticket. So they need the permission of the employer.
Then, it's Outlook.
Growing up, Andrew MacDonald thought of his grandfather as an exotic figure, dressed in dated suits, telling stories about his escape from the Nazis. But Andrew didn't realise he was also one of the greatest living filmmakers, Emmerich Pressburger.
And at 4:30 GMT, we're in the studio with one of Ireland's most celebrated authors, Colm Tóibín.
I think your enemy as a writer is always laziness, is always the idea that if only conditions were right, you could write another chapter.
That's all coming up on the BBC World Service.
You're listening to Business Matters on the BBC World Service with me, Sam Fennick. Coming up in the next half hour, Donald Trump faces a dilemma. He's failed to secure a $460 million bond in his New York fraud case. So what are his options now? And more expensive watches are being stolen. The value has exceeded $2 billion for the first time. But why? We'll find out after the news.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. In their first conversation in a month, President Biden has again warned the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that a military operation in Rafah in southern Gaza would be a mistake. More than 1 million people have sought refuge there after fleeing from other parts of the Gaza Strip. Donald Trump has reacted angrily to his failure to secure the close to $500 million bond he needs to appeal against a judgment in his civil fraud case in New York. He claimed he was being persecuted for seeking to return to the White House. The U.S. Supreme Court has rejected a request by Mr. Trump's former aide Peter Navarro to avoid jail while he appeals against a conviction for contempt of Congress. He's due to report to prison tomorrow. An air bridge has opened between Haiti and the neighboring Dominican Republic as efforts to get aid into Haiti gather pace. The UN said the first helicopter flights had begun. Parliament in the Gambia has voted to revoke a ban on female genital mutilation, removing legal protections for millions of girls. Human rights activists say the move will undo decades of work. The UN Secretary General has expressed concern about the worsening security situation in Myanmar. A spokesman said Antonio Guterres was particularly alarmed by reports of military airstrikes on a village in Rakhine State on Monday. The US software giant NVIDIA has unveiled its latest artificial intelligence chip. The company said it was more than twice as powerful at training AI models than the previous best chip. And an original pair of ruby slippers worn by Julie Garland in The Wizard of Oz are to go on a world tour before being sold at auction in December. They are one of 4 surviving pairs from the film. BBC World News.
Welcome back to Business Matters here on the BBC World Service with me, Sam Fennick. Our guests today are Olivia Stonkel from Brazil. He is an Associate Professor of International Relations, and Rebecca Chong-Wilkins, Senior Asia Correspondent for Bloomberg, joining us today from Hong Kong. We'll start this second half of the programme in Argentina because today is the Argentinian President Javier Milei's 100th day in office. Let's hear from him.
Ministerio de Turismo y Deporte, afuera. Ministerio de Cultura, afuera. Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, afuera. Ministerio de las Mujeres, Género y Diversidad.
So that's the Argentinian President Javier Milei on the campaign trail, pledging to get rid of ministries of tourism, sport, culture and environment, women and gender and diversity. He also pledged to do away with the Argentine Central Bank and adopt the US dollar as the official currency. But lack of parliamentary support is slowing down some of those most controversial reforms, and he says his country needs to overcome Argentina's economic crisis. Annual inflation stood at 276% in February. Poverty levels have reached a 20-year high that same month, and more than 57% rather of Argentinians are now considered to be poor. Let's talk to Oliver about this. So how would you sum up his 100th day in office?
Well, it has been very turbulent, and I think there may be more instability to come. The big problem in Argentina is that people were fed up with the established parties, voted for a complete outsider, much more of an outsider than even sort of the most visible outsiders like Bolsonaro in Brazil or others, who didn't even have a large party structure. So he wins the presidency, but is basically has no majority in Congress and the Senate, has no allies amongst the governors, and so governing is going to be very difficult. And I think from the start it's been an uphill battle. And recently the Senate rejected sort of a mega decree of 300 new rules and norms that he proposed to massively deregulate Argentina's economy. Now he's implemented some of his more extreme proposals, like eliminating several ministries, but on other issues he had to embrace a more pragmatic stance. For example, Argentina will remain part of the Paris Agreement to fight climate change, even though he on the campaign trail said climate change is a socialist hoax. I expect more instability because he's not a skilled politician. He is having tremendous difficulties negotiating with Congress.
Do you think he realised how hard it was going to be when he got into office in his first 100 days?
It's interesting that on the first day he said, we will go through an extremely difficult period, bear with me, because things will get a lot worse before they get better. Now, at first half, it was true, things are now a lot worse than they used to be then. They were pretty bad when he became president already. And now the big question is, will things get better? And you know, Argentines may not have the patience, and there's a long history of Argentine presidents not finishing their terms. So it's going to be, I think, increasingly difficult for him, because there's now a poverty rate affecting 70% of children, for example. And I think there's only so long that a society can kind of support an experiment like that.
We'll have to see what the next 100 days entails. But Rebecca, a story that's front and centre for you at the moment relates to one of the largest beverage companies in the world, and it's facing some criticism. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I think has sort of flown under the radar for a lot of English language news, but it's causing a lot of discussion here. So Nongfu Spring, whose founder is in fact China's richest person, is sort of found itself the target of nationalist criticism online, and it was all triggered initially because the founder of Nongfu Spring's main rival, Wahaha, passed away actually late last month, and since then that triggered a whole sort of set of unfavorable comparisons between these two different founders, allegations about the links between the US of the son of the founder of Nongfu Spring, although sort of the founders come out and try to sort of allay people's concerns, say that, you know, he had made peace with his rival and so on, that still hasn't done much. And it's then sort of morphed, this whole discourse has morphed into criticism about the product Nongfu Spring sells itself, and the spate of comparisons that say that it's overly influenced by Japan. So some of the things are quite far-fetched. So, for example, if you hold up the bottle cap of a Nongfu Spring a product, which is red, if you hold it up against a white A4 paper, that resembles the Japanese flag. And so we've seen that. I have not yet done that, but I can tell you there are quite a number of people online who are, and then they're videoing themselves sort of pouring away the products down the toilet and things like that. So it's gotten quite extreme.
Right. And what is anything? Has this happened? Is anything affected, or has this affected its stock market price?
Yes, we've seen quite a big fallout there. It's fallen about 5% since the passing away of the Wahaha founder, but the market cap that translates to is about $3 billion US. So quite a sizable fallout, and the stock is also continuing to fall despite sort of more broadly in this part of the market actually gaining ground. And it's just an interesting story because I think it really speaks acutely to the risks that even China's domestic giants face. And these are the companies that Beijing is hoping is going to help, in the private sector, lift it out of its growth slowdown.
Well, we were talking about that just before the news, weren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's precisely these type of firms, and historically, it's actually multinationals and international firms in China, or firms in China that deal with the rest of the world, that have faced this kind of nationalistic criticism. And so this is an interesting shift in that trend.
Well, thank you very much for bringing us up to speed with those stories that are making the news where you are. We're going to go to a story now which is making the news in Australia, because Uber has agreed to pay $178 million to settle a class action lawsuit. It was filed by Maurice Blackburn lawyers on behalf of over 8,000 taxi and hire car owners and drivers. Here's how the firm explains their case on their website.
The key points of the argument in the Uber class action are: Uber started operating illegally in Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia and Queensland in 2014 in offering the UberX service, using vehicles and drivers without the proper licenses, accreditations and authorisations. This caused loss of income to authorised taxi drivers and operators and hire car operators. It also resulted in a drop in the value of taxi licenses. The law then changed in these states to make Uber's business legal going forward.
Well, here's former taxi driver Nick Adriankis. He is the lead plaintiff, and this is what he had to say outside court.
The result today I'm very pleased with, as it hasn't been done before. We suggested that Uber acted illegally and they needed to pay, and that they have today.
Well, let's talk now to Karen Percy. She is a senior freelance reporter. She's based in Melbourne. She's been covering this case. How significant is it?
It's extremely significant, somewhat groundbreaking in Australia. State governments have tried to take action against Uber in the past with limited success. This is success. $180 million. It's within the top 5 class action settlements in Australia's legal history. But more importantly, it was an action against 3 separate companies or different entities of Uber, one based in the Netherlands, one based in the US, and one based in Australia. So it's a real kind of, they've really landed a knock on the organisation more generally, because there just aren't very many successful cases against Uber. Now the company, is trying to put it behind them, but this has taken 5 years. A 10-week trial was due to begin yesterday in the Melbourne Supreme Court. So where there was an expectation that a huge amount of perhaps damaging information might have been revealed, even more damaging against Uber. So a significant settlement indeed.
The lawsuit says that Uber operated unlawfully for a period of time until changes were made to make their business fit in the legal system. So what changes did they make?
Well, they were likened to pirates during this particular case, but there were a number of changes that the federal government and others that essentially legalised that ride-sharing kind of operation. But it was reforms in ensuring that drivers were paid properly rather than kind of the lowest bidder on a job. There were protections like other workers, including pension payments and work health and safety, etc. There were minimum standards for vehicles, permits, licensing, and taxing as well. So it had really gone from a sort of an underground black economy, and the app-based side of things when it first came in was very difficult to track. They were largely unregulated, so a whole lot of regulations have come in. But the taxi drivers, you were talking about Nick Andrianakis, he was a man who was in the industry for 40 years. He cannot go back. Essentially what they're saying is these 8,000 taxi drivers and taxi operators and hire car operators, the industry is largely gone. So this is kind of a compensation and a recognition of that.
And is that why that compensation is so high?
It is. I mean, there's very, very many of them, and it's not going to be an even payout as such to all of those people. It will depend on how many licenses you might have had, etc. And there's been notable disruption. You go to a taxi rank, for example, at Melbourne Airport, and the taxis are way out in the dark, in the Never Land. They've gone, you walk a long, long way in the dark and dirty parts of the airport to get to a taxi. Uber is right there, shiny, bright in front. So the change has been quite dramatic. But there was accusations that they misled regulators and that they sort of got up to some hijinks in terms of the legal case as well. So it's been quite damaging for Uber, certainly in Australia.
Well, let's talk about now what Uber have said, because they have said in a statement that since 2018 they have made significant contributions to various state-level taxi compensation schemes, and with today's proposed settlement, we put these legacy issues firmly in our past. What else have they said in that statement?
Well, they say that it is now regulated and Uber offers greater choice for drivers and greater opportunity to make money in the ride-sharing industry as such, and that it's a greater thing for consumers, and that they are, determined to move ahead with safe, secure, and a quality product as well. So, they haven't said very much. Like you say, they want to put it behind them. And I think what needs to be noted here too is at the time this was all happening in 2012, 2013, when they first came on the scene, the taxi industry was kind of ripe for change and was very resistant to change. So, there were issues with the standards of cars, drivers, and exploitation, and a feeling that, not just drivers were being exploited, but there were, consumers were as well. So they were kind of ripe for change, and the taxi industry admits that they didn't really understand what this app-based disruption meant, and governments got caught out as well. So it's not just that Uber came in it, and the allegation in the lawsuit is that they were predatory, and they took part in a whole lot of kind of
Okay, Karen Percy,
the industry here.
Okay, Karen Percy, thank you for bringing us up to speed with that. Let's bring in our guest. Oliver is in Brazil, and I understand that Lula da Silva has sent a bill to Congress in February to regulate workers from ride-hailing apps in Brazil. Tell us about that.
Exactly. So he's made this proposal, which is a bit of a compromise, because it does require companies like Uber to pay a minimum wage. It regulates their work hours, for example. They cannot work more, I think, than 8 or 10 hours a day. At the same time, it says that people who work mainly for ride-hailing apps are not employees and thus do not have a right to pay vacation. And so the bill has found support of Uber. And I think the major advantage is that it sort of does away with this gray zone, which has also made Brazil less attractive for investors. But this is also quite important from a political point of view, because almost 800,000 people mainly work up with ride-hailing apps. So this is quite significant and has also produced a lot of tensions, occasionally protests near airports of sort of Uber drivers and taxi drivers fighting each other. So I think this is largely seen as a positive step to make clear sort of what the rules will be from now on.
What about in Hong Kong, Rebecca? I think you've had Uber for about a decade or so?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear about these sort of frictions between taxi drivers and Uber drivers. It's a very similar issue here, although I haven't heard of any out-and-out brawls in the street yet. But I think it's an issue that's very close to the heart of sort of Hong Kongers. I mean, so far there are sort of these plans to review existing laws that regulate ride-hailing platforms like Uber. But one of the criticisms here has been that actually the Hong Kong's own taxis, those are the sort of the iconic red taxis that some people might be familiar with, have drawn a lot of criticism. People saying that the drivers are rude and they're surly and they don't really have many solutions to pay, so you can only pay in cash for most of these taxis. And the Uber, although it's actually sometimes be substantively more expensive than hailing a taxi from the street or even using that own red taxi app, actually is more preferable because of the ease of payment and the ease of using service. So there has been this sort of real tug of war between the taxi industry, the sort of old taxi industry, and new market players like Uber.
And have there been any sort of strike action? Because we've seen Uber drivers on strike in the United States, haven't we?
So interestingly, it's the other way around, the dynamic here. It's the old taxi industry who have threatened to strike. So they threatened to strike last year. That was actually called off. But they say that, Uber isn't fair, and they want sort of a tougher stance on some of these illegal practices around the kind of ride-hailing services such as Uber. So here the resistance and the complaint has really come from the sort of old taxi industry.
Well, thank you very much both for your insight there, and as ever to Karen Percy, who was also joining us there from Melbourne, bringing us up to speed on that story. Now, there are more twists in the legal battles facing Donald Trump. He can't find a private company to guarantee the $460 million he's been ordered to pay in a New York civil fraud case. The former president must either pay the full amount in cash or secure a bond in order to continue his appeal. Mr. Trump's lawyers say that securing a bond of that size is practically impossible. A court bond acts as security for specific obligations or payments within the legal system, and for a fee, a bonding company would guarantee the full amount to the New York court. They would then have to pay it if Mr. Trump loses his appeal and can't pay himself. So what options does that leave Mr. Trump? Let's hear now from Neil Peterson. He's a bonds specialist at Peterson & Sons Surety Bond Agency in New York, and he says the size of the bond required in this case is a major factor.
With a bond of this size, a surety company to extend substantial credit is probably looking for somebody worth 15 to 20 billion, not 2.5 billion. And if you look up the makeup of, former President Trump's assets, they are heavily in commercial real estate, which for those of you out there that do not know, there is a lot of issues with commercial real estate currently. A lot of entities and different properties are unable to refinance their debt, which they're going to soon be in default. So when you're looking at extending someone credit, you look at their asset makeup, which being a lot of it being commercial real estate, which could have significant problems over the next 2 or 3 years. It's not an asset class you really want to take as collateral. And then taking a step back from that, let's say at the end of 2 years, the surety company has to pay. They have 5 to 10 days to pay the judgment that they bonded. Real estate's not easily liquidated within 5 or 10 days. It could take, weeks to months to a year to sell properties of the size of properties that he has.
So just looking at the figure for a minute, the $460 million, how common is it for individuals to face sums as big as that in civil cases?
It's unprecedented. I'm not sure if any individuals had to pay that amount, so it really just hasn't been done before. Most individuals would just declare bankruptcy.
So it's the size of the bond that's causing the problem, but also the man himself. Is that also the issue?
Well, it's certainly a factor that's being taken into consideration. Last week, he was able to post the bond for a separate action, and the insurer that issued the bond has been receiving a lot of negative press. So that's definitely a factor for a company considering this bond, whether or not to issue it, is the, reputational risk or the headline risk and the backlash that they may face for doing so. So it's certainly not helping the situation.
And then what are then the consequences then of not posting the bond?
So a bond's not required for an appeal. The bond's only required if you want the execution of the judgment stayed pending appeal, which means that the party with the judgment cannot seize or liquidate assets of the judgment debtor, which would be Mr. Trump in this case. So the consequences are possibly having some of his assets seized, property sold, bank accounts restrained. It could be a very complicated, long process to do so, but it's definitely going to cause him a lot of issues. If you're running a business and your bank accounts are frozen, you can't meet payroll, you can't pay bills, it's very problematic.
You mentioned that other people in this situation might declare themselves bankrupt. Is that an alternative for Mr. Trump?
I haven't seen his financial, and I'm not a bankruptcy specialist, but I'm assuming that is an option. He could also put up cash with the court, and I'm not sure what all of his options are, but I think it comes down to, either putting cash with the court or seeing if you get some sort of judicial relief, whether that's through, hopefully the court granting a stay or possibly declaring bankruptcy. I think that could be on the table.
Oh, really? Do you?
Not positive, since I'm not, I'm not involved in that aspect of his strategy, but it's an option, afforded to anyone, so I don't see why it wouldn't be afforded to him.
That was Neil Peterson, and he is a court bond specialist. Oliver, just coming to you briefly off the back of that, are the ins and outs of Donald Trump's court cases something that people in Brazil are following closely?
Yes, actually, it's quite amazing that this is on the news practically on a daily basis, not because people are specialists in the financial trouble he's in, but because the outcome of this election is so consequential. And because this is seen as the most important political event of the year. Trump is remembered as someone who's put a lot of pressure on some Latin American countries, like Venezuela. And, so there's, I think there's a sense that the biggest political question of this year is whether Biden will be reelected or whether Trump will go back into the White House. So a lot of people are paying daily attention to this.
And is that the same in Hong Kong, Rebecca?
I think the ins and outs of the court case is not so much, but this issue of whether Trump returns is certainly being closely monitored, and particularly we've seen sort of market reaction and a lot of commentary around, any time he says potentially I'd introduce 60% tariffs on Chinese imports, or all of these sort of narratives around TikTok. These kind of issues do come up quite frequently.
Yeah, interesting. Well, it's a subject that we will be talking a lot about in the coming months, and I'm sure we will all be talking a lot about it as we approach the election in the autumn time. Now, the number of stolen watches has surged in the past year. That's according to the largest database of watches in the world. It's called the Watch Register. It says that the value of stolen luxury watches has reached nearly $2 billion. And the number of watches lost and stolen now exceeds 100,000 worldwide. Katia Hills is the managing director of the Watch Register, and it's based in London.
We locate about 4 stolen watches every day, and of the ones that we find, about 1 in every 7 watches has turned up in a different country to the one in which it was stolen. So It's very common that we find a watch that may be stolen in, say, London, turns up in California, or, you know, stolen in Paris, turns up in Hong Kong. They're small, they're portable, they're expensive, and they can be easily transported. So this is why watches are really becoming a currency for criminals, and they're also one of the most effective tools for money laundering as well as insurance fraud.
Well, it prompted me to have this item on the programme because I wanted to ask my guests today what they have on their wrist. Rebecca, what have you got on your wrist?
Yeah, I have a sort of fitness tracker, so it has a watch, but it has a time, but I'm sort of much less interested in the time than the steps.
It's funny, isn't it? Because there was a time when no one had a watch, when we all started using our mobile phones to tell the time, and everyone would look at their wrists and their watch wasn't there anymore.
Yes, deeply unoriginally, I am exactly in that category. I stopped wearing a watch about 5 or 6 years ago, and I only really started it recently, and it is purely from a sort of fitness point of view.
What about you, Oliver? What have you got round your wrist? Is it weighed down with something very expensive?
I do have a 5-year-old Apple Watch, and I also use it mostly for workouts. And I actually, strangely enough, only use it in the gym or inside the apartment, because given the security situation in Sao Paulo, it's really unwise to wear a watch in the street. So it's mostly kind of, strange enough, it's kind of as an item that you can't really show because there's a huge problem with, you know, pickpockets, but also robbery. You know, when you're in your car and you stop at a light, some of the, you know, these motorcycles, they drive through the cars and stuck in traffic and kind of watch out who's wearing a watch. So, which is one of the reasons why I don't plan on renewing my Apple Watch for the foreseeable future.
So, I mean, you're talking about a fitness watch like Rebecca is then, but this story of luxury watches being stolen and that increasing, that doesn't sound like it would surprise you where you are.
Not at all, but I mean, most people I know are extremely careful. So there's a sort of a joke in Brazil that people buy these expensive items, but they only use them when they travel to Punta del Este, which is in Uruguay, which is a safer country, or when they travel to Europe. But certainly it's something that if you're wearing a watch in Sao Paulo, an expensive watch, you can't really complain if somebody grabs it.
Well, thank you both very much for your insight today on Business Matters. Oliver Stunkel, Associate Professor of International Relations at the Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo, and Rebecca Chong-Wilkins, Senior Asia Correspondent for Bloomberg, joining us today from Hong Kong. Thank you both for your